Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine.
Welcome to the sixth session of the Early Career Workshop by the DHST, Division of History of Science and Technology. And today we're very glad to receive a special guest, Simone Turchetti, to bring us some experience, to share with us his experience about grant writing. Simone is a professor at the University of Manchester. He is also the principal investigator of the European Research Council research project Neworldata, and a very experienced, very seasoned grant writer with several successful large grants, right? So we're thrilled to hear more from his, to learn from his experience. And he already has participated in several research projects. And unfortunately, Gerardo Ienna was not able to attend due to family reasons. And Simone will step in to talk a little bit also about the Marie Curie schemes. Okay. Please welcome Simone. Sorry, I think I skipped Barbara's comment. I'm really sorry, Simone. Barbara.
Yes.
I also want to say welcome everyone, welcome Simone to this final workshop. Just something about what we do today. So first, Simone will present, as you heard, like he has a lot of experience in the field of grant writing successfully and also as a leader in projects. But then to kind of compensate for not having Gerardo with us, unfortunately, Climerio will also just answer a few questions because he's experienced with grants in Brazil. So this allows us to give a different perspectives as well. That's it from my side. Welcome, Simone. Now you can start sharing your screen and talking. Thanks.
Sure. Let me start first of all to share the screen. Great. So let me start by obviously thanking Climerio and Barbara for inviting me for this session. It's obviously a great pleasure to be with you and share ideas, really. I mean, this is not a kind of formal presentation, so feel free to interrupt me at any time if anything is unclear, or if you actually want to take the presentation in a different direction. It's just really just to share, if you want, ideas about how we can go on around the issue of grant writing. Research grants are obviously a very important aspect of our activities as researchers, because it's the way in which we get the income that allows us to complete the projects. So we want to perhaps share ideas about how we can do this. Let me start by saying, of course, your first question would be, so Simone, who are you and why you should tell us about grant writing? One reason is that so far I've been, I would say, relatively successful with filing and having grant proposals accepted. I have had 2 European Research Councils grants starting in 2009 to 2012, 14, not 12, and an advanced grant more recently, the one Climerio mentioned earlier, Neworldata. Beyond that, I've also managed to succeed in getting more research grants approved with the Horizon program, with FAPESP. I think Climerio will talk a little bit about FAPESP later on, I'm not sure. So you can know more about that and more. As you can see, in terms of income, I received a mix of big and small grants, and this is already something that, if you want, could be considered an item for discussion, because sometimes small grants can actually give you, how to say, a freedom to go around research projects that you don't have when you have big grants, which are obviously far more structured. So think ahead also in your trajectory about the merits sometimes of what we call pump priming funds, small grants, 5,000, 10,000, that allow you just to start to explore something and give you a bit of a perspective. As you can see from my list, you also see a mix of national and international sponsors. Another item you might want to think about: what do international sponsors do? What do national sponsors do? What do they require? What kind of freedom they offer you when you want to carry out a project? And another item you want to might think about is that in my list, there's a lot of collaborative projects. I used to say, sometimes I've just been the principal investigator of a team comprising more than one researcher. And so that obviously complicates things further, as in you're not just applying for a grant, but you're applying for a grant, building a team. And so the question is, do you want to build a team? You don't want to build a team. You want to carry out your research proposal, your research on your own. And so file a grant where you're the only one featuring the grant, or you want to, for instance, expand and have more than one collaborator. These are just some of the things we're gonna explore together. Let me just go further to give you a few general points if you want to think about in moving ahead in this conversation. Grant writing is writing for a goal to get funded. So it's not a kind of freewheeling activity. You're not going on with your research, I mean, developing a narrative and say, right, fine, I'm just, going, I'm great. And obviously, because you're writing for a goal, you want to be really careful about how you frame your ideas, your thoughts, your ways of going around issues that you've been researching, and how you can make them appealing to someone that obviously doesn't know much about what you've been working on, and how you can make that matching what are, for instance, the requirements of your sponsor. Obviously, it is also short-term writing. Nobody will remember you for writing a research application. I've had some of my papers and books cited. I never had one of my research proposals cited, because obviously it's something that nobody really cites. So again, think ahead about the kind of instrumental nature of the writing exercise. It's not something that you write, to kind of fully show how good you are at what you do. You write it to get the funding, okay? And think third point, that grant writing is a negotiated process. What do I mean by that? I mean, fundamentally, that you don't want to, again, writing, thinking just at what are your ideas, your plans, your trajectory in terms of research, but you want to match those with what are the sponsors' priorities. The sponsors will set a number of principles for you. And so you want to match those principles in developing your research application. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about a little bit. Who should be funding your research? What are the big questions to think about when we reflect on preparing a grant proposal, and also how we can craft the grant proposal to actually match what the sponsors ask for. And I'll do this mainly in relation to two particular schemes that I'm a little bit more familiar with. These are the European Research Council scheme and the Marie Curie individual fellowships. So I'll talk to you about these two specific schemes, because are the one that I know better. But that doesn't mean that actually what I'm going to say is applicable only to these schemes. And I think has more kind of general reach, if you want. It applies also more generally to various aspects of grant preparation and application. So first, who should fund your project? I mean, if you look on the various websites, there's a number of potential sponsors that you can think of. I'm taking there a list from one website, and you can see that there's all sorts of organizations out there that are prepared to sponsor your research. Which one you should go to? If you see, some of these are national, some of these are transnational. The United States is a national organization. The National Institute of Health, for instance, is a national organization. Horizon Europe is international to an extent. So in that respect, each one of them offer you something and actually prevent you from doing other things. So the first thing you want to think about, even before start the grant writing process, is what sponsor would be best suited for the kind of ambitions you have in terms of developing a grant proposal. In that respect, think about some of the items that describe these organizations. If these descriptions match what you're looking for, even before you start to think about writing a research proposal, think about some of the aspects of what we call eligibility. Some organizations put boundaries to your eligibility based, for instance, on nationality, based on geographical reach. Okay, so you need to be careful in checking first whether the organization that is offering you money in grants is an organization that you can apply for. The same applies to the kind of situations you're at in your career, because obviously you can apply to certain type of grants and not to others. Some grants are tailored, for instance, for researchers that are at the PhD stage or the postgraduate stage. Again, it is for you to check carefully, very carefully, whether you're eligible or not for the kind of grant you've been offered. This seems to be something less important, but actually it is, namely that all these organizations actually have very different funding remits. They normally focus on specific areas of research, whereas they do not pay attention to other areas. Some are very broad. Think, for instance, about Horizon Europe or National Science Foundations, and in general fund the whole range of studies from science to technology and to some extent to the humanities too. Others instead have a much narrower focus. For instance, the National Institute of Health, where the focus is only on biomedical research and health-related studies. Clearly, if your research doesn't fit in that horizon, perhaps that organization is not right for you. The message, however, is always the same, namely, even before you start writing your grant, think carefully about what is the organization that matches more the kind of research interest that you're intending to develop. Fourth and final, grants also change in terms of size. I mean, I mentioned earlier the grants small and large that I've received. That was to say also that sometimes you want to survey the kind of sponsors out there, exactly to check what are the best, the most tailored sponsors for the kind of project you have in mind. You might think that it is a small project and that actually there's an organization out there that will give you money for a small project, whereas it will be unlikely to fund a large grant. So think about all these variables. They are all very important. I'm now going to focus a little bit more, as I mentioned earlier, on Horizon Europe, because Horizon Europe is, in a sense, the organization that I'm a little bit more familiar with, and I can tell you a little bit more about. Horizon Europe is part of what we call the EU Framework Program for Research of Innovation. It comprises a number of pillars as well as various aspects that I'm not going to explore in detail. What I'm going to focus on is exclusively Pillar 1, which is the one that focuses on excellent science, and that has 3 strands, of which we're going to look at today, at 2 of them. The European Research Council program and the Marie Curie Actions program. The overall program It clearly has a lot of funds, 95 billion, as you can see over there. However, if you go and check at the Pillar 1, and in particular the two strands of Pillar 1 we're going to talk about, obviously you're talking about endowments that are less extended, but still quite remarkable. For instance, for the Marie Curie action, you're talking about something of around 6 billion euros, which is quite a lot of money. Now, what are the Marie Curie actions for? The idea is that the Marie Curie actions are fundamentally to equip researchers with new knowledge and skills through mobility and training. So these are fundamentally training programs. That is to say, if you want to apply for a Marie Curie fellowship, you're essentially applying for not just a grant that allows you to develop your own research, but for a grant that allows you to complete that research by moving into a different training organization and a different academic institution for the purpose of developing that kind of research. It's a very kind of tailored action. It's not something that is general, like the European Research Council that we will talk about in a moment. And so the kind of core criteria of the Marie Curie is the so-called standard mobility rule. Once you submit a proposal, you fundamentally submit a proposal to move to a different organization, the host organization, and that host organization needs to be in a different country, and you need not to have been working in that country for a certain period of time. It changes, it varies over time, but it's in general 12 months in the 3 years immediately prior to the reference date, or so it was, I think, in 2020 something when this slide was made. The Marie Curie Action Fund Marie Curie actions are of several types and kinds. I'm not going to tell you about all of them. I will focus only on the postdoctoral fellowships, which are fundamentally the proper, if you want, grant proposals, the grants that would allow you, for instance, to develop postdoctoral research in a different academic organization based on fundamentally you moving there for a certain period of time, in particular for how long. There's two types of postdoctoral fellowships. There's the European fellowship and there's the global fellowship. The European fellowship allows you to move to this academic organization for a period between 12 and 24 months, with the possibility actually to have a secondment within a different organization for parts of that time. The global fellowship instead allows you to go outside Europe for that period or for up to 2 years, and then return to a European organization for the following 12 months. Now, what is the merit of, before we go to the merits actually, you can see there some acronyms that can be obscure to you, like EU, MS, and HEAC. That means fundamentally that in the completion of a postdoctoral fellowship, you're expected to move into one academic organization within the European Union member states, but there's also associated countries, AC. That is to say, a number of countries that actually you can move to, and they have the same, if you want, rights to host you as the academic organizations of the member states. That obviously is something to take into account. If we go back to what we said right at the beginning regarding eligibility, so you'll need to check, although the program is open to nationals from all around the world, you need to check what countries you can go to, where it can be placed, your host institution, whether, for instance, you can move into one of the associated countries, and all these details is obviously something that you'll have to check in great detail. In any case, I think I made my point. The Marie Curie fellowships are, if you want, probably the most exciting mobility program that exists, I think, at the moment when we're thinking about developing a postdoctoral research, because they really give you that kind of opportunity to go in a different organization, being trained there, get a lot of, for instance, research done. If you're looking at that host organization also as the site, where you can have, for instance, the data or the archival resources that you need to complete your studies. So there's a lot to be gained from the Marie Curies. The European Research Council schemes are very different in that respect. You can see that they amount for 17% of the Horizon Europe budget, with an overall amount of 16 billion euros. So a lot of money. They're all for you to grab and just develop your research if you want. So go and try. The program is divided by, first of all, fields of frontier research. That is to say, it's open to every researcher, but is divided in three frontier research areas: life sciences, physical sciences and engineering, and social sciences and humanities. It comes into three types of individual grants. So here is already where you see a major difference between what I described earlier regarding the Marie Curies and the European Research Council schemes, in the sense that the European Research Council schemes really come as individual grants. It's, if you want, a fund that comes to the host organization, so to a university, for instance, an academic organization, but is entirely made available for your project. So you're the principal investigator, you're the one that, in essence, has the possibility to fully make decisions about that grant, the directions of the research, based obviously on the grants that you've prepared, the grant proposal that you've prepared. And in that respect, it is a funding that allows you really, if you want, beyond the prestige that you get grants, also the freedom to develop your research in the way that perhaps you feel more suitable for your career perspective. It comes in three types: the starting grants, which is for those of you who have already a PhD and have had that PhD in the period between 2 and 7 years. You can get up to 1.5 million euros for 5 years for your research, to pay all aspects of that research, from personnel to travel to research costs of all sorts and kinds. It comes in the form of a consolidated grant if you actually have a PhD, but you're a bit more of an experienced researcher. So you've had your PhD 7 to 12 years before making the application for that grant. And you can get up to 2 million. You can finally have the advanced grant, which has no kind of temporal limit in connection with a PhD, while of course you're expected still to have a PhD when you file your application. And the only condition for the advanced grant is to have a track record of significant research achievement. And for that, you're going to get up to 2.5 million for a 5 years max project. It doesn't have to be 5 years, it can be shorter, but normally everyone that applies for this kind of grants go for a kind of 5 years full research grant proposal. There's other grants I will not touch today, the synergy grants and the proof of concept grants, which are still in the portfolio of grants that made available by the European Research Council. If you're interested in that, go and look at the European Research Council website, or, you know, write me and I can tell you more on this. Okay, this is the kind of overview of, if you want, what I've described as the funding landscape. So let's assume that now you finally made a decision and you've actually decided that you're gonna prepare a grant proposal for, say, the European Research Council or the Marie Curie. What comes next? It is time for you to start thinking a little bit more carefully about what are the big questions that your research grant proposal will address. This is an absolutely decisive element, probably the most important element, because obviously we still want to, we always want to think that what we're gonna propose to research will not just be in line with what we've done before, but rather something that whoever is going to evaluate your proposal is going to say, wow, there needs to be a wow factor. There needs to be something in that proposal that will make evaluators think that your question is big. It's something that matters. It's something that is relevant. It's something that will make a difference. So if you want, the second aspect of my presentation goes exactly in the direction of making you think a little bit more about what is it that makes a question big? What is it that makes it relevant? What makes it topical? Obviously, all of you, I'm pretty much sure, have all sorts of different perspectives in terms of what you've studied, what you're researching. You come from different disciplines. And so the big question will be a different big question for all of you. All I'm inviting you to reflect on in moving into the kind of, not even grant writing, but grant thinking, is what is the big question? And so first of all, you have to think about the innovative character of the kind of research question that you're thinking of. What I mean by innovative character, I mean that if you're probably, as we've seen from the schemes discussed before, at the stage where you're coming out from the PhD and entering your postdoc career, you probably have already familiarized with what it means to do research. And the thing that you want to avoid in moving from that to the grant writing phase is to think about your research proposal in a sense, in terms of an incremental development from what you've done before. So my PhD project looks at A, and I've kind of looked into B that follows from A. So what I'm going to write in my research proposal is something research answering B. This is obviously something that doesn't really work, as in grant writing really starts with a big question that somehow really marks a departure from the research that you've done that far, a new way to look at things, a new way to explore the same things, but from a different angle, a way of posing the question that is different from what you've done before. So that's the first thing you want to think about. How is it that I can reflect on what I've researched so far from a different perspective? Because that is what, if you want, leads you into the innovative character of your proposal. The innovative character is not something that can be just stated. Look at me. I mean, all of that I'm doing right now is new. It's not enough. You also have to demonstrate it. And that is what we mean by relating your proposal to what is the state of the art. The state of the art is essentially the bulk of research done up to the present about that research subject. And for you is essentially what you want to confront your plans with in developing your studies. So it is not just think of a B that it is innovative because it is a departure from the A that you've done in your PhD, but is a B that nobody else has been exploring before. So it is your task in the research grant writing to demonstrate that nobody has been looked at B before. And so you have to relate to a research, to a body of literature that actually has not yet explored that specific field. Third suggestion, think big. Think big means that sometimes we kind of get worried about the ideas we have, and we think that what we do, we're not fit for thinking so, big. Actually, you want to change perspective and do the opposite. You want to think that what you're gonna, if the bigger is your idea, and the better from the perspective of research grants applications, as in what evaluators are looking for is the next big idea. So don't be scared to be too ambitious. Being ambitious is good in this field. It's something that matters a lot. Don't, when we say think big, also don't think just your research remit as what is important to the grant writing proposals, because otherwise you kind of turn inwards into what is the kind of special dimension of your research field, which is something you'd never want to do with grant writing. Grant writing is a way to challenge also assumptions we make about disciplinary boundaries, about what we know or we could know, about what we want to do with the bodies of knowledge or evidence that we already have. So you need to embrace that challenge, and in that respect, think also outside the disciplinary box. Don't just think, oh yeah, I am an historian of science of the 15th century. So if my research proposal is going to cover the 16th century, that's wrong. I can't do that. It's too much. No, it's the opposite. You want to do 15th, 16th, 17th century, even 18th. I don't know. It's a question of embracing these kind of challenges rather than just narrow it down to the very narrow field of expertise you already have as someone that has done a PhD in the area. Think about the relevance of your big question. Is it something that addresses just, if you want, an aspect in your research field? Or is it something that has echoes, repercussions in the world we live in right now? Because this is what evaluators are looking for. They're not looking for narrow questions. They're looking for something that makes sense, even if, and when I say makes sense for now, it doesn't mean that it has to be contemporary research. It can be far back in time. It's not a problem. The problem is how that research far back in time reflects on who we are now and what we do today. How, for instance, address issues that have to do with the origins of our society, of our politics, the way we live, the way we do research, for instance, today, if we're looking at the field of history of science and technology. So think about all these connected aspects as making what we, call the big question. Once you think you have a big question in your head, think also about how is it that you can actually make a realistic assessment of what you need to answer your big question, because this is exactly what goes into the research proposal. The research proposal, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, is an exercise of writing that really, really it's very specific in addressing the ways in which we can actually build a project that answers the big question, and the evaluators will evaluate the effectiveness of the methods that you adopt in answering the question. When I say methods, I mean methodologies, approaches that are distinctive of your research fields and that helps you to actually drive, in a sense, the research project you're building, the range of hypotheses that you make, the body of evidence that you mobilize. For instance, if you say, you know, to answer that question, I need to look exactly at that body of archival evidence. They will look at that body of archival evidence and try to understand how important it is, how valuable it is, how it works. Think about risks and gains. Any research project has risks. It might be that, for instance, in looking for that archival body of evidence, you have to travel to a place, and that traveling to that place presents all sorts of risks. Have you thought about it? And in case, have you kind of made logistical arrangements to make sure that those risks are taken into account? A lot of proposals are being evaluated exactly on those bases. So make sure that you understand what the risks are, and also make sure that you make clear to the evaluators in the research proposal that are gains to be had from developing your research proposal that outweigh the risks that are present in your proposal. Relate to the proposal in terms of showing that you're the right person to carry out that project. You're actually the only one. That's very important. It is very important that you show that your profile matches the proposal, that you're actually in a position to actually develop that project in the best possible way, in a unique way. Nobody else can. And also think ahead about collaborations. I mean, collaborations are not always needed, but it may be that in framing the research project that answers your big question, you realize that you need, for instance, a certain type of specialists, and that you haven't got that knowledge that specialists could grant. You may actually come to the conclusion that the research task that you've been ambitious, you put together a research task that is very ambitious, so big, and it's so big that you can't do it on your own. So that's the time when you start thinking whether the research project that you have in mind would require collaborations or not. I believe that if you're part of this workshop, you're all, in a sense, interested in the field of history of science and technology. And so there might be a number of additional questions that relate to our field as historians of science and technology. For instance, how is it that can relate my history case to the present? How can I make it relevant? Can I demonstrate in a way that my question has never been comprehensively answered before? Can I speak to non-specialists? Can I make my proposals transdisciplinary? And what sources I'm going to use? All these questions, I think, are very important, something that you want to think about very carefully. And that, to an extent, I mean, lead you to give you a bit of an example, just to finish this session, this second section of my talk, drawing on my research project, which is called Neworldata. This is a project that looks fundamentally at diplomacy of research data, how over, say, the 20th century and beyond, scientists have fundamentally set up systems, international systems, to discuss about data management, data policy, data centers, and more. I'm not going to give you the details. You can go and look at our website. It's a collaborative project. It's a large project. It's an advanced grant. So we're also been given quite a substantial amount of money to complete this project. But I'll tell you very briefly how in the research proposal, I've answered those set of questions for for Neworldata. First of all, obviously, I've made immediately clear in my research proposal that the data is not just an item of historical relevance. So it's not that we study it because we are historians of science and technology. No, we want to look at data because it's today a key governance issue. I would say a key world governance issue, which is relevant to the policy aspects of many different countries. Having to apply for a EU organization, obviously I made particularly clear that my historical findings were going to be particularly important to the European Union, exactly because the European Union was going to fund me. I've tried to make a clear case that my question wasn't just relevant, it was also a question that was never been answered before. So I refer to the state of the art. And in that respect, I mean, I'll make a very simple and straightforward case of how I made that demonstration, namely that what I've said is that so far, historians of science and technology have studied a little bit science diplomacy. They've studied data, but nobody has yet studied research data diplomacy. And so in that way, I immediately made a case for how I could go beyond the state of the art. I tried throughout the proposals to avoid jargon. The more you talk in a language that suggests that you're talking only to specialists in your field, the less your proposal will be fundable. Be prepared to talk to individuals that come from different disciplinary backgrounds, have different jargons from yours. The less you avoid jargon, the better. I'll make later on the case that, especially when you're thinking of the European Research Council as a funding body, this is a funding body that has paid enormous attention to how individual researchers can build interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research project that brings together disciplines rather than just kind of build silos between disciplines, okay? So that's another thing that I had to demonstrate. And in particular, I did that by showing that Neworldata wasn't just a project for historians of science and technology, but it was a project that actually would bring together historians of science and technology with international relations scholars, with historians, and with science and technology studies experts. So I tried to make the case that what I was going to build was much more than something of relevance for historians of science and technology. I've also highlighted that I had found sources that were untapped, in particular at the archive of an organization called CoData, working for the International Council of Scientific Unions, and that in my case was something that no other historian had explored before. So again, think ahead about what sources can allow you to make a case for your question being actually a big question. Now, you have your big question, and now you're moving on and thinking, hold on, how is it that fundamentally my big question can actually match what the sponsors ask for? And again, I'll give you a few examples of how that happens. It's fundamentally a process of information gathering on various websites that allow you to get the best information about what the sponsors want and how you can negotiate your big ideas with what the sponsors want. First of all, go out there and look, for instance, at all the information that is available, made available to applicants in various strands of, in various schemes made available by the funders, the sponsors, whoever they are. The European Research Council, for instance, has a comprehensive set of information. Sometimes it's even too long to go through, but it can be a very important exercise, in particular in clarifying some of the principles, the funding principles that are at the core of the funding schemes that you have. For instance, it is immediately stated in the ERC information for applicants that the research proposals are mostly for research teams, although if you are in certain fields, humanities, mathematics, where research is often performed individually, the team may consist solely of a PI, of a principal investigator. Think of that as something that should inform the way you go around your big question. Above all, think about some of the things that are being said about the priorities. ERC funds bottom-up research with an emphasis on the frontiers of science, scholarship, and engineering. Bottom-up means that fundamentally anything in principle could be funded that comes from the bottom, from you, okay? So feel free. However, the ERC welcomes proposal of interdisciplinary nature, which cross the boundaries between different fields of research and address new and emerging fields of research that are unconventional, innovative, and more. In that respect, again, I go back to what I said right at the beginning. Research that follows what we call the trodden path, what has been already explored before, either by you or by others, will not look good in the eyes of the evaluators of an ERC application, because they're looking for something new, something that blends disciplines, that blends teams, that is innovative, that is unconventional. It has to be really a big idea, okay? So in that respect, try to think carefully about how you can match your big idea with what the ERC wants. In that respect, the Marie Curie fellowships are a little bit, if you want, more aligned to elements that do not need to be as innovative, but that if you want, stick to principles of general adherence to what is the mobility process. So you still have to demonstrate that your research is excellent, and in the final evaluation that will count for 50% of the final mark you get out of your evaluation. But they're also looking into impact, meaning if, I don't know, Simone Turchetti tomorrow uses an MSc Marie Curie fellowship to go to Belgium, what will be the impact of that mobility to Belgium on his career, on his publications, on Belgium, the host organization, and more? They also look into the quality and efficiency of the implementation. How is it that you develop a research project that will make sense in the context of you moving to Belgium, me moving to Belgium, anyone moving to Belgium? And in that respect, there are specific categories that need to be addressed in the Marie Curie Fellowship that are not needed for the European Research Council grants. So in that respect, again, think how you can tailor the big question and the aspects of the research proposal you're preparing to what is being outlined in the context of the indications that that these organizations give to the information for applicants. If you're unsure about any of these principles or you want more details, there's plenty out there for you to come in touch with to know more about what's actually these funding bodies are looking for. There's national contact points wherever you are around the world about the Horizon Europe program. There's an ERC executive agency, which has contact points as well. There's national research information offices. For those of you that are based in the UK, the UKRO, for instance, does an amazing job in that respect at clarifying how you can go on preparing a research application. There's university-based division. For instance, I've just taken the details what there, or one based at the University of Milan, where you can just write them and say, okay, fine, I want to do an application. You know, what do you think of these aspects of these things? I mean, is that done this way, that way? Okay, what do research applications then look like? Certainly not as that cartoon. Don't just ask, please, to fund your research proposal. Be a little bit more detailed in your application. Start with instead the templates. Each one of the organizations that fund research, again, I go back to the cases of the Marie Curie and the ERC, have templates that explain you what they are looking for. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, the Marie Curie template is relatively straightforward, but really specific about some aspects. For instance, right from the beginning, in looking at the excellence of your proposal, it gives you clear indications about what they are looking for, the quality and pertinence of the research and innovation objectives, how these objectives are measurable and verifiable, whether they are realistically achievable. So this is already when you move from your big idea, your big question, into something that is a little bit more formulaic, in a sense, a little bit more in line with what the Marie Curie is looking for. You start that negotiation process, in a sense, and think about aspects that, for instance, may not be part of your big question. For instance, if your big question is about something that you've been thinking of, then the Marie Curie application will ask you also think about the gender dimension of that big question. And that's certainly something they say, hold on, I mean, I never thought about gender, but you have to if you want to succeed in getting a Marie Curie application. So think about all of this. In particular, this is something that perhaps you want to think carefully about. There are certain questions that will look extremely obscure to you at the beginning, but actually are very important. For instance, the question of impacts of your research, measured in terms of career perspectives and employability, as well as expected contribution of proposed skills development to the future career, what they're asking for here. Well, after various years of being, amongst other things, also an evaluator for Marie Curie programs, I can tell you that the reason what they're looking for here is an ability for you to explain what is your career trajectory. So what you're planning to do once you finish your Marie Curie fellowship. And B, how the sets of training activities that you plan ahead in the context of the Marie Curie will help you to further develop in terms of your career trajectory. These are key questions that are obviously very specific to the Marie Curie Mobility Program that you want to really address if you want to succeed in that program. Otherwise, you won't. The template for the ERC program is relatively easier, is articulated around two parts, part B1 and part B2. I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a moment. There's no specific jargon, this time understood as something that belongs, for instance, to the Marie Curie applications. You're free to write as much as you want, but in writing as much as you want in the way that you want, that certain aspects will have to immediately appear in the proposal because they are important in immediately setting an opportunity for you to move to the next stage of the application or not. In particular, the proposal summary, it comes immediately, and it aims to provide immediately an overview of what are the objectives of the research proposal and how they will be achieved. It sounds, that you can write whatever you want here, but actually, here is where you want to immediately demonstrate relevance from the scientific and possibly social and political viewpoint. I'll give you a straight example of that. This is the beginning of Neworldata. I already mentioned Neworldata before. Is the project for which I got the grant. This is how I started it. Research data are vital components of any scientific enterprise, and the introduction of more inclusive world data exchange practices is a decisive factor locally and globally in strengthening capacity for research and innovation and tackling societal challenges. Yet we know comparatively little about what international negotiations have paved the way to the current system of research data circulation. Neworldata aims to blah, blah, blah. What do you notice there? First, relevance. From the very beginning, I'm immediately making clear that this is not just about me being an historian of science and technology researching something that would be of interest to historians of science and technology. I'm immediately clarifying that this is important to everyone, especially to the scientific community, strengthening capacity for research and innovation, but also for the society at large, tackling societal challenges. I make clear that immediately that I go beyond the state of the art, yet we know comparatively little about. And finally, I clarify what are the aims of the project in a kind of very straightforward and short way, okay? So this is to show you that immediately, I think, is important that you show from the project summary that you're prepared to go general and not just very specific with your research proposal, and immediately show relevance and how you go beyond the state of the art. Now, there's an aspect that perhaps might look specific, but is very important about ERC applications. As I mentioned earlier, these are interdisciplinary research grants, and that element of interdisciplinarity is something that ideally you want to show from the very beginning, starting with selecting your ERC review panels. Now, the research put together by the ERC is not just divided in 3 field research field areas: physical sciences and engineering, life sciences and humanities and social sciences, but in sub-panels that essentially are already setting specific areas of research. As historians of science and technology, we are looking in particular at the social sciences and humanities panels are the ones that are more relevant for us. But it's for you to make a specific assessment of what panel are in line with your research, because this will be decisive to the evaluation process, and in turn might mean that your research for the ERC will go in the right directions in terms of being evaluated by a panel that is more aligned to what are your research interests, or to a panel that is not aligned. So you need to make that kind of extra research on that. In particular, if you look at the social sciences and humanities 8 panels, you either, for instance, might go with the panel SH6, the study of the human past, which has SH614, history of science, medicine, and technologies. Or if, for instance, you're more geared towards a bit of a sociological approach, you might go for SH314, science and technology studies. It's a matter of choice. You can combine this panel, immediately showing interdisciplinarity. You may show interdisciplinarity, for instance, saying that if you go back, your primary ERC review panel is, for instance, one in SH6 and another one is SH3. For instance, you can combine history of science, medicine and technologies with science and technology studies. Or you can be even more adventurous, ambitious, combining ways that are different. For instance, combine global history and history of science, global history and science and technology studies. It's up to you how you do that. The question is, the more you do it, the more you show the interdisciplinarity that the European Research Council is looking for. Now, I mentioned earlier that the template ERC proposal comprises a part B1, which has an abstract, an extended synopsis, a CV and track record, and a part B2, which has a scientific proposal and a funding ID. The scientific proposal and funding in part B2 is an extended version of what you present already in the extended synopsis. And the two parts needs to be submitted in one go when you do your submission, but they're actually evaluated only in different stages. In particular, part B2 will be evaluated only if part B1 pass the first stage. As you can see, step 1 comprises essentially an analysis of part B1 by a panel of generalists, one of the panels that you've seen earlier, and then only 30% of the proposals will be retained to go into step 2, where specialists in the field will look into your part B2, the full proposal, and make an assessment of that. The result will be either a score A, woohoo, you should be funded, score B, you'll not be funded, but you will have the opportunity to apply for the next year, which is already a big yes, a big good thing. Or score C, I'm afraid you won't be funded, you have to wait for the next year. How much time does it take to write a proposal? Well, there isn't a set time. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the proposal. And just to make things even more complicated, I'll tell you that sometimes I've been writing proposals that were funded and that were ready in 2 hours. And I had others not funded that I spent months trying to complete. So there isn't really a big answer to that question. That said, obviously, I'm pretty much sure you're full of big questions. So you already have a range of big questions, and you'd be prepared probably to write a research proposal in just, a couple of hours. The question is, it takes a lot of time to adjust the big question to what are the frames that I mentioned earlier, the frames intended as principles, funding principles of the funding sponsors, of the funding bodies, as well as the understanding, familiarizing with the templates of the research proposals. So even if you think, of course, I know what is my big question, I can write about my big question in 5 minutes. Yes, you can, but it will take you 5 minutes to write about your big proposal, but it will take probably days to understand what the research sponsors, the funding bodies, want from you. And so how to adjust your big idea to what the sponsor wants. Other questions, maybe something where we could start to talk a little bit more together. What can seriously compromise my chances? Any idea? This is a simple one, huh? Not reading the information for applicants. Again, it's just, you want repeating what I just said before. You're unlikely to get funded unless you really read carefully what the applicants, what the sponsoring bodies really want from you. What is the ideal narrative structure for a grant proposal? Okay, nobody wants to answer this. I'll do that. There isn't a rule. Start with what you're familiar with, what you like, what you want to do, your ideas, your ambitions. But the only recommendation I would give it, again, start with something general. Don't just start with the details of a problem that perhaps nobody from other fields will be familiar with. Start with something general and then move into details. Take into account that evaluators tends to be very busy people, and either you capture their attention with something relevant straight away, or they'll quickly lose interest and say, okay, fine, I just have no time for this, okay? Must I work towards setting up a research team in ERC grants? I've given you the answer to this. So you can score 5 points straight away and have a grant from me. No, I'm joking. I won't give you a grant if you answer that question. Yes, no, no. The answer is no. But the research tasks set by the big question should drive your decisions. Again, if the research task that you're thinking of is very big, please, 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 really think that perhaps collaborative research may do for you if there are various corners of your big questions that require, for instance, a specialist that looks into something specific about language, about methods, about a set of archival documents that he or she knows better than you about. Perhaps you could bring that person into a collaboration because that would benefit the project and therefore make it more likely to be funded. Should I include a budget? Yes, absolutely. Budgets are absolutely decisive. And there are aspects of the budget that you might, at this stage of your career, be not that familiar with. A budget includes, for instance, expenses for personnel, for consumables, for travels, meetings, research, equipment, and more. I mean, many of these items is something you might not have thought about, saying, okay, but what I need for my research? Pen and paper. No, you need more than that. So you need to go into reflecting on all these aspects. In particular, I won't tell you about person month because I think it would make this discussion very boring. But I'll tell you about trying to find a research officer in your university. I mean, your university or your department will have someone that is responsible just for preparing budgets, preparing costs for a research proposal. Go to that person, tell them, I want 3 collaborators for that amount of time. I want money to travel to the United States for research, archival research, or to a conference. I want to buy a new laptop, and all of this will be quantified by a research officer and will be a feature of your research proposal. Evaluators actually evaluate both the proposal but also the budget aspects. If you're because you're asking sometimes for big money. If you're asking for an ERC grant, you're asking 1 million euros, then they want to know where this money is going to go. Okay, and you need to be very specific. If you say, oh, I want a laptop, and they see that it costs 60,000 euros, they're going to say, hold on, that's not right. It shouldn't be that. No, that's not the cost of laptops. Obviously, that won't move that kind of objection on something so trivial. But for instance, when you start to look at personnel costs, when you start to look at cost of consumables, of all sorts of items, they will raise objections if these are not right. Should my research plan be detailed? Yes, indeed it should. Start to familiarize with Gantt. Some of you may know the early 20th century engineer and manager Henry Gantt, who's the guy that started thinking a little bit more carefully about aspects of scientific management. We use Gantt chart normally to visualize how we can relate activities, tasks, research activities, research tasks to specific schedules, specific timeframes, and in that way kind of make sure that our Gantt charts drive the project that we develop. And that's an essential feature, for instance, of Marie Curie applications, and that's sometimes useful to European Research Council grants too. For instance, I prepared one for Neworldata, so I'm going to show you what my Neworldata Gantt chart look like. As you can see, there are aspects that were research tasks that were extended throughout the period of duration of the grant, administration, for instance, and other that would typify the grant only for specific periods of time. And that would entail, obviously, employing people for certain periods of time, spending money in a certain way for certain periods of time. So all these aspects of management are absolutely decisive to the writing of research grants and also to the outcome. Finally, I mean, we're moving towards the end of this presentation. I hope I'm not being boring you too much, but let's talk about you as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important that you show that it's not just the research proposals that is viable, that is interesting, that is exciting, but actually that you are the only one that actually have the qualifications and expertise to develop it. How you do that? Obviously, there will be sections of the research applications that you see, for instance, again, the templates of the European Research Council application that will be very straightforward. Just add your details in a very kind of straightforward manner, nothing rather than your CV in a kind of very straightforward way as accordingly to the template that is set by the ERC. I'll show you how I introduce mine just so that you can see that this is a very straightforward exercise. However, there are sections of the template that allows you to add information on your research career, on your achievements, on your peer recognition, and more. Use those sections to fundamentally make the case that you're actually the person that is tailored for that project, that you're the only one that has that kind of expertise. In other words, tell your story. Tell how you've arrived at being someone that can actually lead on that project in a way that nobody else really can. Demonstrate that you're uniquely qualified for what the project demands. And if you can, I think this is very important, especially going back to what we said earlier, considering that the ERC and Marie Curie schemes, these are international schemes. These are not national schemes, for instance, for Belgian researchers for Belgium, or Dutch researchers for the Netherlands, or Italians for Italy, okay? These are international. So the more you show that you have an international profile, the more likely you are to be kind of considered in this kind of schemes, because obviously they are looking for people that, in the case of the Marie Curie, are prepared to move abroad. But even in the case of the ERC, they want to look into questions that either require international collaboration or that are, if you want, relevant, I wouldn't say globally, but at least regionally, looking at Europe. So if you can, try to show your international connections, your study abroad experiences, the links that you have, the collaborations that you have ongoing. I'm working with this researcher here, this researcher there, and this is important because together we are doing this. All of this is very important. I've finished my presentation. I hope that it was not too boring. But the final question at the point of the presentation -7 is, will you win? Will you ever win your grant? Unfortunately, it's not for me to say. I wish you good luck. But I mean, I'll give you a few pieces of information that can help you at least to understand if you have a chance to succeed. Namely, if you look, I mean, these are all data, but it's not that the situation has changed dramatically since 2013. If you look at the success rate for ERC calls in the 5 years between 2007 to 2013, you'll see that fundamentally 1 in 10 proposals are being selected for funding. That's something quite, I mean, that makes the scheme quite selective. It's even, I mean, but here we will go into one of the gender dimensions that you want to talk about in your research project. It's even, if you want, more punitive for women, as that they normally have less opportunities to succeed in this kind of competitions than men. And so, you know, this is the nature of the challenge. Will you be that 1 in 10 if you want to apply for a ERC grant? The data for Marie Curie is slightly less punitive. You're talking of a rate of success of around 15–16%. And again, what is interesting though is that there's really a lot of projects that have been selected from the social sciences and humanities. And there's also a wide range of nationalities that have received funding in 2024. So there is hope. There is hope. And on that note, I finish my short presentation. Just to end, obviously, all of this was a bit short, a bit, kind of covering a wide ground in a short period of time. But if you want to know more, please contact me. That's my email address. I'm happy to give you more help as much as I can in dealing with these schemes.
Thanks a lot for the presentation and also for sharing your contacts. Maybe you will receive a lot of questions now because we have not a lot of time left for the questions and answers, but nevertheless, I'm going to read some of them. But firstly, Mayor, just 2–3 sentences on your experience with Brazil, because Simone has a lot of experience in European grant applications. Please just add a few sentences and then I go to the questions.
Well, I'll try to be very brief. We should give time for questions. First, I think just 3 points I would like to make. Some of them Simone has highlighted, but I think it's important to highlight as well. First is that to increase your chances of getting this grant, Simone showed very well that's usually very competitive. I think you should engage with relevant social questions and political priorities. I think you should really pay attention to the details. This is especially true for Brazil, that now we have very focused grants. They really state. And one of the priorities in Brazil it's different in Europe for what Simone presented here is that here most of grants are directed to form teams. So if you want to apply for a grant of the National Research Council in Brazil, you have at least to have a minimum of PhD students, a minimum of researchers, and they have a criteria to make sure that the grants will be directed to teams. The second point I would like to make is that you should become very aware of the community that will evaluate your group. Here in Brazil, we have this history of science is in a gray zone between science education and history itself. So it means that we are being evaluated by people who are neither usually not historian of science. So historian of science will be minority in any situation. So that's why it's very important for you to understand who are the people who will be evaluating and how to engage with them. Simone brought many very interesting points of how to build this dialogue, framing questions in a way that you can interest everybody, right? And people who are not from your field of specialty. And I think the last point I would like to make, it's like you should use this process to learn about the research communities and environment. Not only in your country, but also in other countries, and be open to potential life-changing experiences. I would just like to add a few opportunities that Simone didn't mention, and I think it's very important, especially for PhD students and early career researchers. They are smaller grants with much greater chances of success. So one is the consortium, the Consortium for History of Science and Technology in Medicine, which is hosting our workshops, offers a series of short, small grants that will help you to do research in different institutions that are part of the consortium. So these are usually much easier to get than the SPIE fellowship, so these grants from the European Research Council, but they're also much smaller, of course. The American Institute of Physics also has this grant in aid that will allow you to do research in not only in the institute itself, but also can go to libraries that are potentially relevant for fields like physical sciences in general, not only physics. The Chinese Academy of Science now is becoming much more international, and they have like this called PIFI program PIFI. That has several different types of grants. You should also take a look at this. And the Brazilian Research Council as well, they offer some opportunities for international students. So if you don't be afraid of language, if you want to experience some environment that's very different of Europe and North America, so you're welcome to apply as well. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Climerio. I think you added a lot of other perspectives, and also it was not only about Brazil, which I think was good, because you showed us as well the opportunities of the consortium. What I'm now sharing is the questions that we have collected, and I think because we run a bit out of time, Simona, you are also invited. Some of the questions I won't pick, but maybe you can just answer them in written after, just briefly. But I pick now, you should see it all on your screen, the blue one, the first on line 279. Sometimes proposals need to be very short. How do you think you put down or you summarize an argument in so short, like in 2 pages?
As I mentioned earlier, it's very important that you think of the details as details. And that's something that can be, for instance, removed. Once you start to put together the proposals, think about what are the general points. The general points is what should really go into the proposal, whereas all the rest can be kind of, removed and then treated separately as either, for instance, as a matter that goes into the extended proposal, if you're talking about the ERC, or you can just deal with it in the running of the grant project if you're funded.
Okay, thanks for the answer. So the next is someone who writes about the perspective from intellectual history and thinks that is very hard to get a grant to compete with other fields. What do you think? How do you convince a scientific panel of the merits of intellectual history?
I think I was talking about from the perspective of social history rather than intellectual history. I think I was talking really in general. And it's a question of, again, showing relevance, showing that the research has importance for who we are today, intellectually, socially, politically. That there are no. I think my experience as an ERC applicant shows is that I was never challenged in my proposal in terms of, oh yeah, but you come from that field, so you have less chances. It's because it's obvious that nobody has ever challenged me that way. Everybody was constantly challenging me, always from the perspective of how relevant it was, what I was talking about, how important, how significant. Especially because, we're talking about big money, and obviously they want to give big money to people that can show that relevance. That answers the question. It's not about disciplines. Every discipline, I think, has, to a large extent, the same opportunity. It's a question of relevance.
Okay, thanks for the answer. I picked one question was about Marie Curie, and someone has a family and thinks it would be easier to just have a affiliation but stay in home. Is that possible?
Again, look, get in touch with the national contact point for Marie Curie and ask them. So I'll make available the slides. I'm someone that obviously knows certain aspects of these programs, but I'm not an administrator that is responsible for this program. So I'm even kind of scared that by answering that question, I might actually take you in the wrong direction. I'm giving you the tools though. Get in touch with the national contact point and ask exactly that very question, and they'll be able to help you in a far more efficient and correct way.
Okay. So before you talked about the risk and gains to travel abroad, so there's a related question. Someone is a foreigner and must consider certain issues related to export control limits and the receiving country's policy limits. In that way, in the project, one proposes has to be framed inside those constraints. What do you think?
Okay. Right. We're going really into a mine territory where, I mean, I can answer to an extent, but I mean, I wouldn't be prepared to make, or what I'm saying, a general case. Now, export control regulation is typically national regulation, it's not international. So, funding bodies, of which I've been talking about, like those in the Horizon project, will not move objections to this kind of things. As far as, I mean, I'm trying to phrase this. It will be a question of the national authorities of the host organization to deal specifically with the host, with the export control issues. There are, however, a range of issues that are covered by the Horizon Europe funding. And these have more to do, for instance, with issues such as the safety of the researcher, which can be a risk. For instance, I mean, can't go into detail, but obviously you've read the news about what's going on right now in the Middle East, okay? So imagine that, you know, you decide to write a research to carry out, I don't know, archaeological research somewhere in those regions. Any evaluator would obviously be concerned at that point that although the research is fully viable and exciting as perfect, there may be issues there exactly because the funding body would not be able to, for instance, make sure that there are safety conditions that allow for that research to be carried out without dangers, without risks for the participants. So you might get to a situation where even just emphasizing your risk contingency measures is not enough, and you'll need to rethink about your research based on that.
I think you just show us how important that it is to really think ahead already in the proposal.
Yes.
You write that
So,
you really have to make clear how you deal with these situations, right?
all the scenarios need to be thought ahead, well ahead. When you write your research proposal, you want to think about all the scenarios, risks, possible obstacles, ethical issues. I mean, obviously, these are perhaps less relevant to a number of areas that have to do with the history of science and technology, but for instance, are far more present when you talk about history of medicine, and more generally, for instance, medical applications, medical fields. So all of this needs to be, yes, fully addressed and assessed beforehand.
Yes. So now I'm talking about something that also first you need to outline what is the goal of the research. And someone is asking, do these aims and goals, must they be fulfilled as presented, or can they change in the time when
Okay.
there's evidence or anything?
While we always write grant proposals, and we do that to the best accuracy possible, a project is a project. It's a thing that grows up, you know, on its own. It's your baby. You never said, you know, the baby has something that will follow in a sense, you know, all the principles that you set at the beginning. So there will be deviations. The question is obviously to deal with it in the most constructive ways as possible. Try to keep in line with what are the aims and goals, but acknowledging at the same time that as you travel into the unknown, you know, the path can change.
So of all the points, I think this is a relevant question for most of us, or many of us. Of all the points that you talked about, what would you say are applicable for PhD funding? So PhD scholarship application, is there a difference? How do they look like?
I would say that it depends what we mean by PhD scholarships.
I imagine someone who's still doing a master's and wants to have a PhD scholarship. What is the
I
difference?
mean, there is not a general rule. I mean, I must say some of the most elaborated research proposals are prepared, for instance, are for PhD bursaries. And there are those that have been more tough to be approved. So there isn't really a major difference in terms of degree of, difficulty in terms of. I wouldn't say that to get funding for a PhD bursary is easier than to get funding for an ERC or a Marie Curie fellowship. Let's say that when I found myself explaining some of these aspects for a PhD application, there is perhaps a tiny, a little bit less detail. For instance, you might not need a Gantt chart. For instance, when you're writing a budget, this is something relatively less important because you have a set salary plus fees that are set as well. And I think sometimes sponsors give you a little bit amount of money to travel to research archives, but again, it's not a lot as far as I know. So it is not like these are big items that would require, for instance, to look for a research officer in order to write a budget. The budget will be something far easier to complete. The nature of the proposal, the research questions is also expected to be somehow less refined and sophisticated. But again, I would warn that that depends a lot on the sponsor you're asking money to. And some sponsors can be very, very demanding, even just for PhD scholarships.
So before closing with this, I just summarize a few questions I'll ask about how do you frame big questions? How do you develop big questions? What is your trick here?
My trick is to think about who you are in that phase of development of your research. So you might have actually come out just from the PhD, you're happy, you're relieved, you've done something that is a bit of an achievement. Now start the phase 2. Think about the same problems, but from a different perspective. I'll make an example which is very, and that's not going to take a long time. It's going to take a very short time. My PhD and first book came out from the history of an Italian scientist who was at one point accused to be an atomic spy. In preparing my first ERC project, I started thinking about this notion of surveillance and espionage, but rather than apply to individuals, I started applying it to the whole Earth. So this is how the Earth under surveillance, the TEOS project came about, saying espionage wasn't anymore something belonging to individuals in the Cold War period, but it belonged to things, the Earth as a whole. I know that it sounds fuzzy, and it wasn't fuzzy. It was actually very realistic, and there's books now that describe all of that. But this is just to give you an example how you shift the focus from something into something else in the process of thinking big questions.
This has been a podcast from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. For more information on this topic, as well as other podcasts, working groups, fellowships, and resources for learning, research, and teaching, please visit www.chstm.org.